This episode is proudly supported by ArtsPay. As a hospitality owner, you know that when it comes to business, the right tools are everything, especially when it comes to payments. ArtsPay, based in Australia, is a payment solution built on a unique model. They give 50% of their profits back to the arts community. They provide world-class point-of-sale payments and support that make your operations run smoothly. But with every transaction, a portion of the fees helps build a permanent funding source for Australia's artists and cultural institutions. What's best is it costs less too. The result is a powerful way for your business to grow and become a force for good. You're not just taking payments, you're directly supporting the vibrant culture that makes our communities unique. ArtsPay believes that business should add up for everyone. For more information, go to artspay.com. ArtsPay, it pays to make the change.
The fact that I get to make a living by half my time helping people that benefit from what I know, and half my time is still spent getting to hang out with people that I'm fascinated by, really admire. I feel very, very grateful to be, to play a weird niche role in an industry that I love.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. What happens when a fine dining chef discovers a new passion? Chef Tim Greaves shifted his focus from exclusive kitchens to a mission of sustainability, embracing practices like foraging and fermentation. He now helps chefs and home cooks alike create a more mindful food system by teaching them how to do more with less. Tim, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Huck.
It's great to get you on the show. I know you're a busy man doing all sorts of consulting gigs, but how are things at the moment?
Good. Yeah, good. Certainly got my hands full. I'm based over in WA, so living in Perth, and back here after almost 18 years in Europe. And my wife and I came home to start a family, which has worked. So we've now got an 18-month-old daughter. So we're running my own business, doing 4 or 5 things at once, and trying to be there as a decent husband and dad certainly keeps me busy.
What's things like in Perth at the moment? Why did you land there?
Good question. I think like so many of us, COVID presented some big changes. I was still living just outside of London at that stage, running a business, and we'd actually just renovated a house. COVID happened, and it sort of made us wonder. We'd planned to come home in the next 5 years. I think we'd been overseas longer than we thought we would have been originally. We wanted to come home and start a family, and COVID happened. And then a year into that, thinking, it'll end shortly. It was going nowhere, and we kind of just thought, what if this is the new normal forevermore, and we weren't comfortable being so far from home. So we decided we wanted to come home and be in Australia, start a family, and be closer to family, just not that close. So all my family's on the East Coast, and travel and sort of keeping myself busy with new opportunities had become a pretty big part of my life. So when we decided to come home, it was like we didn't have too many contacts in Sydney or Melbourne. I was from Canberra, didn't want to live there. My wife was from the Gold Coast. We didn't want to go there. We'd lived in both those places and done our time. And weirdly enough, we just had a lot of family, friends, really, really close friends that had congregated in Perth, some of which were from Perth, some of which had just randomly we'd lived with in London or worked with at different times in Europe, and they'd all just ended up here. So we were like, you know what, we want to go home. We don't know what the long-term plan is, but Perth seems like a great start for the first couple of years. I think that's how it started anyway.
Well, you're doing all sorts of projects over there, and at the forefront of that is a mission about sustainability and changing ways for home cooks and also chefs. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I had to reflect on it a little bit just, prior to this show to kind of give it some cohesive narrative. I guess what I'm lucky enough to be, working in exactly the space that I want to be in. I've been in hospitality for 25 years and done the fine dining thing. Most of that's been working as a chef, but over the years, I've acquired a few other little skills that I realised kind of come together to. The easiest way to explain it is consulting, but I mean, really, so what I'm doing about a little more than half of what I do is industry to industry consulting. So I either do short-term projects working with different brands, different venues, upskilling their team, just teaching them things that, I sound older than I am, or maybe I sound as old as I am. But back in my day, it wasn't that uncommon to, certainly where I worked anyway, it wasn't that uncommon to get in, a side of beef, even in a small place, to be working on, baking, pastry, butchery, working with whole fish, making stocks, making sauces, charcuterie and cheese making, things I probably picked up a little later, but they're no longer everyday things in, many establishments. So, yeah, about half of what I do is probably industry consulting on short-term projects, doing sort of upskilling and training other chefs. And then the other side of that is longer-term projects. So I didn't set out to be a consultant. It's one of those things I kind of just helped out some friends and then helped out more friends and then found businesses that wanted to get me in perhaps to do some menu consulting or just some looking at systems in their business. And then it kind of turned out that probably what they needed was a bit deeper and a bit more in line with what I really like doing. So, yeah, I mean, over the years, I've become more and more interested in sustainability. I think, having a daughter, having a child, but also just, getting older, being a little more health conscious, and also just, I guess, trying to focus on what I really love about food and what originally got me passionate. And I think it's changed over the years. So now, I guess I work with venues where there's a particularly good fit. So, I'm not really. You'll probably see, I'm not super commercial. I don't do anything really to market myself on a social media sort of stage. And I've had a few offers, quite a few, to do work, or I've tried to work with some businesses where really it was kind of the more conventional consulting. It's probably what they were looking for. Someone to come in and help them analyze their systems and just, get their head around the figures, put in some decent stock taking practices, and nail down on the menu costing, and that's fine. But I mean, sorting through spreadsheets of the cheapest price for frozen chips doesn't really float my boat. So it's more when I've got people that are really, really passionate, really good at certain things they do, and just might be having either lacking some skill or lacking just yes, I guess just a little bit of work around systems. But normally it's more. So what I mostly do is kind of going to businesses now. I'm lucky enough to go into businesses that and share, I guess, what's made me successful, or what's been the secret behind the success in some of the better businesses I've worked for. And it's it's probably getting back to basics. So I'm a massive food nerd and a bit of an obsessive. And without knowing it, some of the first places I worked in when my career was just starting out, they were very much about making money almost out of nothing, wasting nothing long before it was sort of trendy, about zero waste just for survival. And just because that was the sort of food we had. And what it relied upon was sort of skill that you took for granted back then. A lot of people would be making, stocks and soups and sauces and things from scratch. And nowadays, with those things lacking, often effectively where I find a good fit for myself in businesses is when they're really open to these sort of things. They've often, so I work with a lot of venues that are farm to table or winery based, or in a rural setting, and it's often about. I guess I'm on my own personal mission. I'm jumping around from topics here, so sorry about that. But I think often for me, it's about showing businesses how to make money. But and that's what most hospitality consultants do. But really, my primary aim, I think I'm always there with my own agenda. I'd like to see them working with the best suppliers they could possibly be working with. I'd like to try, I like to try and feel like I've had a positive influence on the industry that's done a lot for me. And I think a lot of the time it's about showing people how they can add value. So I like working with suppliers that, by the nature of what they do, have to charge a bit more. And it's not about showing people how to make more money by using the cheapest commodities available. It's more about showing them the multitude of benefits of doing things properly, I suppose. And I guess that's what I'm going to be talking about at Fine Food. So I'm working with Luke from Tathra Place, who's obviously you know well, and you've had on the show once or twice, I think, and is in that regen farming space. And I think that what I can often do is go into venues that are looking for help with their menus, or just, coming up with a concept or putting things together. And when I'll present suppliers like this, that I'm excited and motivated about what they do, but then the hurdle is often, well, how do we get a return on that? How can we justify paying the higher prices that they require? That's when I can kind of offer value. So that's when I can often it's about upskilling the staff so they're selling the story properly, but also upskilling the team so that then able to utilize every aspect. From talking about, I mean, with butchery, nose to tail eating, it's not just sort of a buzzword, and it's not just something that's trendy. It can often be the difference between making the same profit out of some truly exquisite produce, as opposed to making it a comparable amount of profit by using the lowest quality commodity beef you can get a hold of. So I'm not sure what you've managed to get from that. So I guess
Well, I want to explore sort of how to put sustainability practices into a venue, and perhaps we can look at a case study later on when we're talking. But first, let's go back to when you were young. You mentioned Canberra. Is that where you grew up, and what was food like for you and your family growing up?
Yeah, good question. And it does, I guess, when you look at it in the context of how I've arrived to be where I am, it does start to make sense to me, at least. So I think food for me growing up, I'm an only child. And my parents separated when I was pretty young. So we went from midweek dinners, they weren't the most festive affair with a big family there, but they were always at the table, and it was always home cooked food. There was three of us, and then, later on there was only two of us there. But what I realized is that, like on my dad's side, English family, and on my mum's side, very, very Australian sort of typical family, white Anglo-Saxon, and we're talking the early 80s. So, meat and three veg was actually the norm. And I think as I started to really get passionate about food, and I was, in my early teenage years or early 20s, and I'd been cooking for a long time, I was always very jealous of people with the non-narrative, people that grew up in perhaps an ethnic family where they were probably, perhaps embarrassed by their culture or whatever. But I was always so jealous of the sort of experiences that they were exposed to, working, having a lot of friends growing up that were from ethnic backgrounds. And I always felt like their families were so much more food focused and oriented. But actually, I've realised the older I've gotten that I was actually really lucky myself. So we didn't grow up with a lot of money, but almost everything we ate was made from scratch. And even though my extended family, weren't the most adventurous of cooks, things that I totally took for granted. So I mean, from on my mum's side of the family, I grew up with a grandma that had raised, well, there's two separate families, but seven kids, and pretty much she did all the cooking for them. And we might not have had the most glamorous food. It wasn't, it was only later when I moved to Europe or when I worked in sort of restaurants that I was exposed to more exotic food and European food, and let alone, any sort of Asian food. But what we did do, most of the vegetables we ate were homegrown. Certainly in my grandparents' house, everything came from the garden. My granddad on my dad's side was a big fisherman, so going fishing, and nothing glamorous. It wasn't deep sea fishing out on boats catching snapper and tuna. It was off rocks and off wharfs and catching mackerel, catching tailor, catching bream, but using every single part of it. We'd come home and a lot of holidays and things were spent with my dad's parents, the grandparents on my paternal side. And yeah, I mean, fishing was sort of a 3 or 4 times a week thing. Most dinners I'd sort of be helping with, and as I say, almost all the veg we ate came from the garden. My granddad's a Yorkshireman, so notoriously a bit of a skinflint. So nothing got wasted there, and for me, all of that was just something I took for granted. And on my mum's side, my grandma there as well, as I said, had raised quite a lot of kids. Never really had an affluent background, but took pride in everything we ate was delicious. And I think some of the early memories I have is going down for school holidays and going out and either shooting or trapping rabbits, as a young kid, and then coming home and having my granddad show me how to skin them and gut them, and then my grandma turning them into rabbit stew, or the same going out and fishing gams and coming home and having a nice hearty lunch of redfin and other things like that. So at the time, it didn't feel particularly glamorous, but I realised that all of that played a huge role in my early sort of experience with food. Yeah.
What about becoming a chef? When did you first sort of get an inkling of that, and what was your first steps into the industry?
Yeah, so I think it's almost, I was going to say it's all I've ever wanted to be originally, but it's not quite. In thinking about this, I remember that actually when I was 4 or 5, I was pretty certain, I was positive that I was going to be an adventurer or an explorer. I'm not actually sure, what that does, what that looks like commercially, but that was it for me. I think I was raised on too many books and lots of stories and fantasy, and probably just thought that that was a viable way to live. I'd become much more sensible, and by the time I was 6 or 7, I was going through a bug catching, insect catching phase, always been a bit of a nerd and would get obsessive about whatever I was doing. And I also liked Indiana Jones. So someone told me what an entomologist was. And at 7, 7 until I was 9, I was 100% going to be an entomologist. Because in my mind, it was like, that's someone that studies insects, I'm sure you probably know. But in my mind at that time, it was pretty much Indiana Jones who caught bugs. So danger, mystery, international travel, women, the whole lot, I'm sure, just with, bug catching being the focus. And that was all I was ever going to do. And then when I realised that wasn't the case, and the average life of an entomologist as a scientist probably looks nothing like Indiana Jones, I quickly lost interest in that. And from then on, really, it was probably literally about 8 or 9, I thought I wanted to be a chef. I think I was just always hungry, and I knew that there wasn't enough time, and that when Mum was in the kitchen, the food would come out amazing because she'd put time and effort in. When Dad was in there, not so much. And then I wanted to figure out how I could do this for myself. So there was kind of just an early drive towards self-sufficiency and being able to make myself better food. I think when I was 8 or 9, I realised that I was doing all right at it, and that was pretty much when I decided I wanted to be a chef. How I actually got started, so I was a bit of a wayward youth. I was, going through a bit of a difficult stage. I was got a good memory and always was able to do pretty well at school, except I was just a bit of a nuisance, and I'd get bored quickly, get bored easily, and distract other people. So I'd often get myself into trouble. And I was literally, I was 15. I was only just legally able to work, and I was doing all right at school, but it wasn't really the best fit for me at the time. And I knew that I wanted to be a chef, and I was starting to get into a bit of trouble, and it was sort of like, well, you probably need to get a bit more serious. And if an academic path isn't the right thing for you, then, what do you want to do? This was my mum sitting down with me and having a talk and saying, well, you've got to be doing something productive. Why don't you call some restaurants? So me being somewhat, again, ambitious when I get my head onto something, I rang, I think, 50 restaurants that day, wrote a basic, wasn't even an email then, it was a letter, typed up a letter and rang about 50 restaurants, and actually didn't realise that it was relatively easy to get a job in hospitality at that stage in general. So I got about 40 replies. And then from that, I thought, actually, what am I trying to do here? What sort of place do I want to work in? So this is almost pre-internet. Internet was around, but I wouldn't have known how to use it. But I did some research and figured out that one of the places that had offered me a trial shift was pretty well regarded as the best restaurant in town, or one of at that stage. And yeah, long story short, I'm making a short story long, but I went in, and, I went in for an interview. I realized, I thought I was, I'd wanted to be a chef for a long time. I thought I knew lots more than I did. I was pretty keen, and then realized how much I'd had to learn. I realized the pace of a restaurant like that, I think in the first week, that it was far more serious and was going to be far more demanding than what I might have expected. And I think it was a formative moment for me. It was kind of like, this isn't something, you're either going to have to commit to this and do it properly, and rethink, what your priorities are, or it's not going to work. And I think it was about, literally a week in to working, proper hospitality shifts as a 15-year-old kid. And I decided to make the commitment really at that stage. And I think, it's only really now, later in life, that I realise how influential that choice of working there and some of the skills I learned there have been.
What venue was that? And, in those early years, what were some of the other important venues for you that you worked at as you cut your teeth?
So this was a restaurant called Fringe Benefits avec Jean-Pierre. So Jean-Pierre Serix was the chef and the owner. Huge influence on my life. And he'd been, I think, geez, the hospitality industry's changed, but he was one of the few people working in the fine dining space and in French cuisine in Canberra back in that stage. This was very late 90s, maybe 2000. He'd had a 15-year, I think, stint at the Tower on Red Hill. And then he'd moved to a city premises. So this was on Marcus Clark Street in the city. Anyway, so, I mean, yeah, so it was influential for me because, wow, I've always been into food, always loved food, thought I knew a bit about food, thought my mum was a fantastic cook because she'd occasionally make some steak Diane or beef bourguignon, and then suddenly found myself in a restaurant working with adults and professionals, and yeah, it was a big eye opener. I think probably the most formative thing for me, as much as, I mean, we can all relate, we're all in hospitality, everyone listening to this, and certainly, that's what this is about. But I think I didn't realize at the time how different my experience probably was than a lot of my peers. So this was a European chef, he's Swiss-born, French-speaking Swiss, had a decent career in Europe and then been in Australia for 25 years at that stage. There was almost no turnover, so it was a small team. There was only 5 or 6 of us in the kitchen. Almost everyone there had been there for years. I did my apprenticeship with two other apprentices that had both done their whole apprenticeship there. I think we had 2 or 3 people in the 4 years that I worked there that were new hires. So totally out of the norm. I think also I was probably the only kid at TAFE doing TAFE as a 4-year apprenticeship back then. One of the only kids that I assume it's still the case now, but a lot of the focus at TAFE on the theory side of things with your apprenticeship is all rooted in classical French, obviously. And I think I was the only place that we were using that same language and that same terminology and doing a lot of that stuff at work. So I'd be learning French terminology and doing things to try and to pass a TAFE, and effectively that was still the norm for us. And it kind of, at the time, I think it felt a bit dated. Like, it was all I'd ever known. I did my whole apprenticeship there, and I kind of felt as though I was jealous of some other kids that were, or other apprentices that were working at sort of more modern venues that may have opened or closed, and probably are no longer around. And I totally underappreciated at times the almost timeless value of what I was being taught. So I had quite a European style apprenticeship, 4 years, long hours, I was constantly told that it was the easiest place I'd ever work, that it was the easiest that I'd ever be treated, and that I should be grateful for being put through my paces. And still to this day, it was by far the hardest place I've ever worked, but taught me so many things that have put me in good stead elsewhere. But I think for contrast, some other places that were formative or that sort of balanced that out. So I was still living at home. I was only like 15, as I said, maybe just 16 when I was a first and then second year apprentice. In my third year, I moved out of home, and in those days, it was about $200 a week, I think, for being, doing 50 hours a week as an apprentice, roughly. So it was barely enough to rent on. So I took a job at a lower, a place that I didn't, I took a second job working at a very, very busy cafe just in the city, doing like a 7 a.m. till, maybe 12 p.m. shift, 3 days a week on top of the full-time hours I was doing at Fringe Benefits. And it was totally different. It was all mostly Indian and Sri Lankan and Pakistani chefs. We would do 300 covers over a breakfast/early lunch shift in an area that was the size of the dish pit where I worked at Fringe Benefits. Nothing was made from scratch, but the food was delicious. It wasn't all convenience products, and it was just totally organized chaos compared to where I was working most of the time. And I think that was the first eye-opener, the first time I really experienced the more stereotypical hospo career. And that was very, very formative for me. I think seeing that there was more to the industry, and I guess I'd kind of been not looking down. I'm not in a pretentious way, but I was quite proud of where I worked and how everything was done properly. But a busy day for us with 6 people in the kitchen might be doing 50 covers. And it suddenly was an eye-opener to see 3 people that probably had no trade qualifications but were amazing cooks being able to bash out 300 people in a couple of hours out of a space that was bigger than our sort of staff changing area, as small as, sorry. So I think that was seeing that and learning to really work at pace, and that, yeah, not everywhere can be fine dining and with, multiple people focusing on one plate at a time. So I think that was interesting for me to see. And then another venue I worked at, just the first venue I worked at once I was qualified before I left Canberra, was La Scala. So it was, again, I'm probably using the term a little bit loosely, but for early 2000s, it was fine dining Italian. And it was what I liked about that, probably what was most instructive for me there, was that they were a hugely popular venue. They'd been around for a long time in Canberra. They had a huge following. We were busy every day, every night, functions, booked out pretty much, almost daily. But the culture in the kitchen was so different. It was another European kitchen, almost all European cooks or chefs. I learned to make gnocchi and tortellini there with the owner's grandma. Literally his nonna, he was 50 and his grandma was still coming in. And I'd come in early to learn to make breads with her and learn to make gnocchi and tortellini and things like that. And I think the difference was, though, that there was just look, I'm probably taking up too much airtime here, but I mean the contrast between the two, Jean-Pierre at Fringe Benefits being very hard line, very French, very strict, very competitive on the line in the kitchen, and then the culture at La Scala was almost family. Like, it was busy, and everyone there knew how to work in the kitchen. Everyone there had some pretty serious skills, but it was just it was friendlier. Like, it was a lot. I don't really know how to define it better than that. It was just it was almost, I mean, the owner was the chef on the line. The guy next to him, his sous chef, was his brother. His mum was a regular in the kitchen. It really felt like a proper family affair. And I think it was just as competitive. It was just as busy and took itself just as seriously as Fringe Benefits. But I think the culture amongst the staff there, and it feeling really like a family, and about that probably being some of the most important aspect of what they felt had contributed to their longevity as a business. Those things all had a big influence on me, I guess.
You mentioned that you left Canberra, and you also mentioned that you were in the UK before returning to Australia, to Perth. But, in that period of time, were there some really key sort of venues or moments for you that sort of shaped your career?
Yeah, so I think, I'll try and, I haven't done well so far at this, but I'll try and summarize and keep it sort of brief. So it went like this. All I'd really wanted to do from when I started was work in the best place I could, get my hands into food. I did a whole apprenticeship in Canberra in the fine dining space. Kind of over that period, I decided that for me, the path was going to be 2 years in Europe, maybe a year in London, a year in Paris, and come home and open a restaurant. And I was certain that's what I was going to do. And nothing, didn't, as the best laid plans of mice and men, as it goes, nothing like that happened. So what did happen? I went overseas. I went to London and I worked for a couple of years. I worked for the first 18 months, and I had been obsessed with Europe and obsessed. I was sure that was where I was going to figure it all out and find what I was looking for, and that was the Mecca. And I realized a couple of things. One, I realized we're spoiled with the level of produce and the level of talent in the hospitality industry in Australia. Things change over time, and that still applies today, though. But particularly, it just made me realize how lucky I'd already been, and the skills I'd acquired, the people I'd worked with, and the produce I was working with. I also realized that I didn't want to just see the inside of a kitchen for 2 years and then come home and that be my story of Europe forevermore. So I actually decided to take what was meant to be a really short-term segue, a sabbatical, I suppose, out of hospitality, and literally just do some commission-based sales work. There was friends of mine, and I'd never seen myself as a salesman. You're probably already realizing, though, I could talk the leg off a chair, but I didn't realize that about myself. And I'd come off the end of what was an 18-month contract. I was actually working as a private chef for a law firm. It had been pretty grueling and worked. I'd achieved a lot of my goals. I got to work with produce I'd only imagined. I got to work with chefs from Michelin star backgrounds and sort of roll up my sleeves and get stuck into, the European kitchens I dreamed of. but I also realized that I wanted to see a little bit while I was over there. Anyway, long story short, I've said that too many times already. Long story short, but I took a job that was meant to only be a few months, sort of commission-based sales, really. So working for a company that were just those annoying people in shopping centres or elsewhere that you might see promoting for products. We'd go in and just do some short-term promotions in venues and at big events. And what I realised was that I'm massively obsessive about food, but I'm also a bit of a monomaniac, and I tend to deep dive into whatever I'm focusing on. And I did really well at the sales side of things. And like the short version there is I did quite well. I was asked to stay on. In a very short time, I went from sort of being just a commission-based salesperson to pretty heavily involved in their business. I was sort of doing recruitment and training, and I guess using parts of my brain and my previously unrealized skill set that had been there, but I didn't realize I defined myself so much as a chef. It's what I saw myself as. It's what I thought that what I felt defined me. But I realized in quite a short time there, I'd actually really the reason I was successful, I realized later, was pretty much everything that the hospitality industry had taught me. So all I did was come into a job that some people could do, some people couldn't, the sales side of things. But if you could do well at it, you didn't really have to apply yourself that much. It wasn't much effort. All I did is sort of come in and go, holy crap, like in half the time, half the time that I might like in the hours that would be half a week in the kitchen, I can make twice as much money. And where other people would come into that and sort of suddenly start working half as much, I just applied my sort of hospo background and started doing 50 and 60 hours a week and did quite well out of it. But where this is going is after a couple of years, I realized that there was, my passion is hospitality, it is food, it was restaurants. But it had sort of awoken in me realizing that I had some other skills, I guess. I had another skill set there, and I spent a bit of time thinking how I could apply that to what I love, to my passion of food and the restaurant industry. And I'm not doing a very good job of summarizing this, but over this period, what had happened is my wife and I we bought our first property. We decided to move just a little bit outside of London, and I suddenly found myself in sort of this quaint little English town that was, what we loved about it was it had its, which is rare there, but also rare here in Australia now. It had an independent butcher, an independent baker. It had its own sort of couple of wineries nearby, and it seemed amazing. But as we lived there and we sort of immersed ourselves in the town, I realised that how many of these businesses were struggling. So I became really good friends with the butcher and the fishmonger and the baker, and then it sort of transpired that it was actually these little independent businesses in a small area in England were struggling to stay viable, and all that was really missing, I realised kind of the passion I had and the knowledge and skills that I had from an early 10-year career in fine dining, paired with the skills that I'd sort of pretty much already had, but developed over a couple of years in sales and marketing, I suddenly realized that I had a neat little toolkit that I could probably use to help some of these businesses. So this is all where this is going. I didn't actually decide I was a consultant. I didn't market myself as that. And a lot of the work I did for the first year and a bit was actually just voluntary. It was kind of just becoming friends with some amazing producers, some people that had good concepts for food businesses or that were already in food businesses and were just struggling either with promoting themselves or marketing or explaining to the consumer, educating the consumer about why what they were doing mattered and was probably worth paying 10 or 20% more for. And really as a sideline to what I was doing, so, my full-time job, I started working with some of these guys and had some early success. Helped a few of them stay in business, helped a few people, and sort of quickly developed a small group of I guess businesses and friends that I'd worked with that I'd been able to have a noted produce some market success for them. then, sorry, I mean, this is probably going to need some heavy editing. Sorry. Look, from there, I think so. Fast forward here, I'd done my hospitality thing. I'd sort of had a 12-year solid stint between Australia and then the UK in fine dining. I'd taken this 2-3 year segue sabbatical, and moved into sales and marketing. But already I was looking for how to get back into hospitality. So I was still at that stage friends with a lot of hospo people. I was regularly doing shifts in kitchens. I was helping out doing events. I just found myself with a bit more time and money than I'd had previously. And part of what I did was, pretty much use all of my spare resources to travel quite a bit more and to actually volunteer a lot of my time. I found I had more time than when I was working primarily as a chef. So I kind of used that time to travel and to some paid work, but also quite a lot of volunteering between wineries, restaurants, even fruit picking and things like that, just to be able to kind of acquire some of the skills that I'd wanted. So yeah, and sorry, I'm jumping around from one thing to another. So I'll jump back. So when I started helping these businesses and doing some small scale sort of, it was consulting in those days, helping them with short-term projects to try and either improve their market reach or just the profitability of their businesses. This happened to coincide with, this was around the same time, just before COVID happened. So something I also did then, we were new to this community. We just bought a house and was sort of putting out feelers and putting down roots. And one of our neighbours had decided to start a food-based charity. He had no background in this, but felt compelled to do it, thought it was a good thing, had some spare time in the work he was doing. And we started talking and things had gone pretty well. He'd mentioned his idea of starting this food-based sort of community kitchen to some local people, and they'd been able to put him in touch with people that could provide a premises and funding. And at the stage I was talking to him at, things had escalated quite quickly and he hadn't really known where the idea would go. And in 3 months later, he's kind of had the funding, had everything ready to go, but didn't really know how to start. And I felt I had a bit of spare time on my hands at that time. I don't feel comfortable unless I'm doing 80 hours a week on something. And basically we got involved in what started out as, it's called the Hazelmere Kitchen Project. And it was taking surplus waste food to do with logistics issues, but also just surplus waste food from venues and things like that in the UK, and then repurposing it, making it available to charities and commercial kitchens so it could be processed and made into meals for supper clubs and soup kitchens and things like that. So this was a sideline for me. I was working full-time in sales marketing, but I was probably doing 10, 15 hours a week, consulting projects, helping out friends in the food business because I kind of couldn't really ever keep my hands out of it. And then this came along and it was meant to just be sort of like a couple of hours on, admin and then some prep and service on a Sunday. And then we'd run it for about 6 months and it became very, very popular. It was growing. We were busy all the time and, producing a couple of 100 meals a week. Then COVID happened and then suddenly it sort of blew up. So we were considered as essential sort of workers, so we were allowed to still move around and things when the rest of the city was on lockdown. Suddenly a lot of people that weren't homeless or really particularly vulnerable found themselves without food or, without means to be able to, to feed themselves or get access to food. So we went from doing a couple of 100 meals on a Sunday to running 4 days a week and doing several thousand meals a week. Anyway, so all of this was kind of a sideline. And really it kind of made me realize that I should probably just admit to myself that I never really wanted to get out of hospitality. I took a bit of time. I thought to myself, okay, like I've done all right out of the sales and marketing thing, but it's never really been a passion. How do I tie all of this together? And I was just starting to sort of look into perhaps there's something to doing consulting on a bit more of a regular basis. And then COVID hit properly, and then we were suddenly all on lockdown. So like many of us, stuck at home and with limits to what we could do. In the early stages, I started what later became Forage Fire. So moving out to a sort of semi-rural area, I reconnected with some early childhood memories of sort of growing veg and that being a big part of what my grandparents had done, and realized I actually didn't know a lot about it. So I started, again, got a bit obsessive, read everything I could and jumped in the deep end. And I think the first year I sort of got into home gardening, I grew, a bunch of edible stuff and probably 4 or 5 chili plants. And the next year, decided that the logical step was to grow 150. So I grew 150 chili plants of different types and different varieties, because I'd made friends with a bunch of breeders and growers and commercial horticulturalists and things from around the world. So then I sort of documented that journey, some of which during COVID, and then I ended up with a commercial quantity of chilies. So then I thought the only thing there to do was to become a hot sauce maker.
There were many of them during COVID. At Fine Food this year, you're going to be talking about sustainability and breaking down a whole pig and sort of what you can do with it. But tell us a little bit briefly about that, and just some really good tips on getting the most out of a whole animal in that sense.
So at Fine Foods, I'm working with Luke from Tathra Place. I'm highlighting his regen farmed duck, and actually this came about because I'd been. You'd asked before about Fine Food. Like, I think I went to my first Fine Foods Australia show while I was an apprentice. We did a trip up to Sydney and went to a fantastic restaurant, and for me it was quite a cool experience, working in a small restaurant, being in your own little world. Being exposed to the much broader hospitality industry and getting to do some networking and things like that was kind of cool. So it's cool to be back here, having come sort of full circle and getting to come back and talk about what I now do and how I've arrived where I am. But so what I'm going to be doing is something I do as a consultant with the venues I work with. Often it's not really about just looking at your bottom line and it's kind of about doing more with less. Can we justify spending more on good quality produce if the quality's there, if we can pass that value on to customers, and if we can use absolutely every aspect of the animal? So what I'm going to be focusing on specifically at Fine Foods is nose to tail. I think we're calling it everything but the quack, as just a little short demo and workshop on various charcuterie that can be made from ducks. And I think the reason we're doing this and why it's stuck, I mean, what Luke produces at Tathra Place, it's a great example of regen farming, and I think it's worth getting the word out there. And I think also hopefully helping people that might balk at the fact that you're going to pay a little bit more for the quality there. How do you justify that, and how do you get a return on it? So what I'm going to be looking at is breaking down a whole animal and then using some basic methods that allow you just to make a bit more money, to get a bit more return out of using the whole animal. So we're going to be looking at confying parts, obviously the legs, but also the meat from the neck. We'll be looking at making some sausages using the skin from the neck and some of the trim from the breasts. Looking at making some ham-on or some cold smoked duck breast from the breasts, and then also doing sort of like a ballantine, like so a sausage with the trim and some pork, then stuffed back into the skin from the neck. So the reason we're focusing on duck and why it's interesting is it's sort of like I work with a lot of venues that have the time or the space or where they're situated in the supply chain means that they've got access to their own produce, or they've got a lot of space on their farm or their winery. What I think the message I'd like to try and get across at Fine Foods is showing even smaller venues or venues that may not have the space to do their own dry aging or to be making a lot of their own difficult charcuterie. The benefits of spending a little bit more to get good quality produce, making that story available to your customers and getting it out through, your staff training and onto the menu. And then in the kitchen, the benefits aren't just making a little bit more money or meaning that you can afford to make a little bit more profit when you're selling the breasts or the legs because you've used every other part of the animal. It's also about the value to staff retention. So I didn't do a very good job of conveying this, but one of the things that influenced me about where I very first worked, everyone stayed. So I came as a first-year apprentice, and there was a second year already there and a third year already there. And 4 years later, when I left, the second year had gone on to work at the Fat Duck in the UK. And the third year was still there and was the junior sous. And for me, that just felt normal. It was hard work, and we did a lot of hours for little money, but we were treated with respect and given so much value in terms of the knowledge we were provided that it felt normal. Why would you leave there if you were really passionate? And I think that's a bit lost nowadays. I think part of the message I want to convey at Fine Foods is, yes, you can use better quality produce and maybe get some warm, fuzzy feelings, by using ethically reared meat. If you're a bit more creative with what you do in the kitchen, but don't underestimate the benefits to your junior staff. Someone that's learning how to make things from scratch and break down a whole animal and do a bit of butchery, make some basic charcuterie. I think those are the things that keep other hyperactive, ADHD, wayward youths like me around for long enough where they can actually develop the skills to add value.
You're certainly adding value to many establishments these days, but what do you love about what you do?
I suppose that I get to give back. So I've described myself as a consultant quite a few times in this call, and it's funny because I've described myself more as a consultant today in the last half an hour or whatever than I have in the last 2 years while I've been working as a consultant. I kind of help by helping where I can. My goal is to try and solve problems and share the skills that I've got. And I get a real buzz out of doing that when it's working with good people. This is probably why, I could be busy all the time working with venues that just want someone to do some stock take and help them hire a chef and put some systems in place. But it's when people really are hardworking and motivated and just lacking one or two things, or are ethically driven to be running a business that treats people well or uses good products, but doesn't know how to join the dots to make that feasible for them. And if I can come in and get people inspired, give them some systems, give them some recipes, and then show them how to roll up their sleeves and actually get stuck in, and that's the difference that allows them to run a better business and have a better impact on both the industry and their customer base, as well as the industry at large, then I'm very happy. I think I'm very lucky. Look, I'm an obsessive. I read like 50 books a year, and half of them are food related. The other half are all sorts of wide ranging things. I eat, sleep, eat, sleep and breathe food. And I've always been like, from very early on, I think I worked with better chefs. Like some people, repetition isn't great for me. I need something to keep me interested and keep me inspired. And a huge part that's inescapable of being a chef is just doing the same thing over and over and aiming for perfection with consistency. And that's had a big impact on me. And I've acquired, some benefit from having to adopt some of that. But really, I think what gets the best out of me is new challenges. And I feel like I get to help people. So I get to basically do exactly what I want to do. I get to talk to people that are hugely passionate about food. I get to share my skills. Half the time I find I'm the expert in the room. I'm talking to people that need my help and want to learn from me, and I'm able to deliver value to their business. But the other half of the time, what I get to do is hang out with the people that otherwise, like, that I'm obsessed with. Like, meeting you and talking with you. Actually, really, I've talked at you. But just speaking with you today, and I hope we get to speak again. That's been brilliant for me. And Luke, from Taft Replace, like, these guys are my heroes. These are like, I was never I'm not a huge sports guy. I never collect baseball cards or football cards or, whatever. But if I did, they would have been chefs and restaurateurs and mixologists and suppliers. And I think the fact that I get to now meet, talk with, work with people that I really admire, and I get to be the stupidest person in the room as I'm learning more about agriculture or viticulture or, all sorts of things that I'm lucky enough to be surrounded by and immersed with. The fact that I get to make a living by half my time helping people that benefit from what I know, and half my time is still spent getting to hang out with people that I'm fascinated by, really admire. I feel very, very grateful to be, to play a weird niche role in an industry that I love.
Well, Tim, it's an honour to have you on Deep in the Weeds today to hear a part of your story. Look forward to hearing more of it. So please keep in touch and we'll catch up again soon.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks very much.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Stay safe and be well.